For our next panel, we can expect some compelling discussion as we debate the future of the board. So please welcome on stage our panellists. Please put your hands together for BAE Systems Chairman, Sir Roger Carr. General Secretary of TUC, Francis O'Grady. John Lewis Chairman, Sir Charlie Mayfield. Managing Director of Board Intelligence, Jennifer Sundberg. And to host this session, please welcome Her Majesty's Lord Lieutenant for Greater London and IoD Board Member, Ken Olisa.
I wonder whether you've ever asked yourself the fundamental question, what is a board for? What's the purpose of having a board? If you're an executive, you probably asked yourself many times why the hell you have to put up with a board, but that's not the question I'm posing. The question I'm posing today is, what's a board for? And to discuss this, let me kick off with Sir Roger. What's a board for?
I think there are two fundamental purposes. The first is to oversee performance of a business, and the second, and probably most important, is the values of a business. So it's about culture, it's about strategy, it's about monitoring the business as a board member, but it's also ensuring that the culture that you're seeking to import into a business is thoroughly baked into the DNA.
The board exists to fashion the business of tomorrow from the business of today. I tend to boil it down to two words, steering and supervising. So steering, taking those big decisions, and supervising, making sure that what you think is being done is what is being done and it's working. I think the challenge for any board these days is to own their agenda. And I think whilst it's easy to say that a board exists to steer and to supervise and to build the business of tomorrow from today, in practice, in the largest organizations, especially the heavily regulated ones, board supervision, or company supervision, can fill all the time available and some, and really crowd out any time on the board agenda and the calendar for actually talking about the business, the growth and the story of tomorrow.
As we look forward, because this is about the future of the board, do you see companies becoming obsessed with dealing with the regulator rather than following what Roger and Jennifer are saying, which is it's part of the mix of the things that have to be concerned about?
I do think there's a lot more compliance required, which does take more time. But that can be managed with good board processes and good committees, for example, to make sure that they're taking some of that load. I personally think it is doable, but you just have to be quite single-minded about it. What we've started to do in the partnership is say, well, let's start the board meeting with the most interesting strategic conversations and finish it with the more routine matters. Just to make sure that the agenda doesn't run itself.
When it comes to supervision, what is it that we need to supervise, and how do we want to balance our time between steering and supervising? So taking a very deliberate approach and a very open, transparent approach to how the board spends its time and what it spends its time on, and not allowing the hamster wheel of habit and convention or last month's board agenda with this month's date on it to be what dictates what gets done in the boardroom.
The clarity of purpose is very important. I also think to believe that the sort of standard model of 8 board meetings and 2 days away for a strategy review doesn't actually do the job. It can only engage not simply by reading the papers, but by visiting the businesses, by meeting the managers on their own particular turf, understanding what is happening in the pulse of the business, as well as taking the broader view as to the market in which it operates. So I think this is a continuing learning process. It is about consistent engagement, which is why, as a non-executive, you have to give more and more time to do the job properly, and then to take moments of very calm thought and reflection to ensure that the direction of travel for the business is still very much in the way that you intended when you laid out the objectives in the first place. So it's very engaging. I think that's the only way forward.
Don't we have to ask ourselves some bigger, tougher questions, though, about why...
Well, I thought I was asking the questions. You're supposed to be answering. Oh,
well,
all right.
This is the kind of introduction of challenge that maybe
What's wrong with my
questions?
questions?
Well, some of the tougher questions like why trust in business is so low currently, why there is a sense that so many decisions that are taken for the short term and not the long term, as we would see in other countries, how that's feeding into some of those long-term problems we have in the UK about tackling skills, tackling climate change, tackling investment and productivity, and to what extent the way boards currently operate, we actually are seeing some of those other stakeholder interests addressed, because as shareholders become more and more remote and shares change hands at a much faster pace, then there are other stakeholders like the communities that businesses are cited in, or the workforce itself, that may become the new stewards of long-term interests, which has to be good for business.
Okay, that's a very good question.
I agree, first of all, that trust isn't as high as it should be. But I do accept there's a job to be done in terms of ensuring that the value of business is recognised and fully committed by the community at large. Unless people are working together now and recognise what the common objective is, businesses simply won't thrive, and they won't be perceived to be working in an appropriate way in this day and age. And that's a management responsibility.
Clearly, there is a perception that there's been a problem of groupthink within our boardrooms.
Groupthink, yes.
And I've been a supporter of transforming the boardroom in terms of gender. I don't believe that women by nature will necessarily transform what happens in a boardroom, but I do think there is something very odd and unhealthy about having a monoculture of men. When workers are represented in the boardroom, that you are more likely to see higher investment in R&D, more account taken of wider issues like the environment, an ingenuity and real nous about operational matters that otherwise would be absent from conversations, and much better industrial relations. And I do think sometimes in Britain we do talk as if all wisdom resides in boardrooms that exclude workers, whereas I think most people with any practical knowledge of business know that there is an awful lot of ingenuity within the workforce that needs to be tapped to. It seems very strange to me that the UK is now in a small minority of EU member states who actively exclude workers from the boardroom. What kind of message does that send to your workforce? That you're really good and thank you for everything you do, but you're not good enough to sit around the table with us.
I absolutely agree that having elected directors from our workforce, from partners, makes a very material difference to the conversations that we have. It does mean that there is a greater balance, I think, than there would be otherwise, and it does mean that there are perspectives that are brought to the table that we wouldn't otherwise hear, and that is good for the board debate and discussion. There is an important point, though, to make, which is that the partners who are elected to the board aren't just employees. They're actually elected by the shareholders, and they are themselves effectively shareholders. I won't go into the ownership structure in detail. So there is, and that combination is very important. And from governance terms and legally, that means that they're not conflicted in a way that actually you could find you might be if you were just an employee on a PLC board, where you wouldn't be able to actually just act in the interests of the employees. You'd have to act in the interests of all the shareholders in the company.
Culturally, we're not there yet, but I do think what is happening in boardrooms, and I think this is very healthy, is that there is much more attention now being given by the shareholding community to the makeup of boards and the mix. And it's something that executives, chief executives and chairmen are challenged upon by the shareholders when they examine the mix of skills, the mix of gender, the nationalities when it's appropriate. All of these things take you to a point where a blend of skills and a blend of experience, very often management who have worked their way through from operating in the shop floor, therefore bringing the right perspective with them, when that blend stops groupthink. And if you wind the clock back 20 years, when I first joined a board, this consideration was not high on anybody's list. It's now high on everybody's. Succession planning, skill sets, mindsets, gender, very important for a healthy environment. And I think the further we go towards creating that mix, the better for all businesses.
I mean, regulation's a necessary evil, I think, in our world today. So I'm certainly not saying we shouldn't have any. I think we absolutely have to have it. And indeed, short-termism and the need to deliver results short-term, although that can sometimes be taken too far, isn't a wholly bad thing either. There also needs to be just as much attention paid to how boards add value and what behaviours and what kind of agenda management leads to that outcome. I've never known a board that didn't want to spend more time on strategy.
A big, I suppose, focus, I believe, for the future, both for the future of the board and the future of technology in the boardroom, is going to be looking at how you can harness the power of technology to better equip and better enable your board to take smarter decisions and to see what matters by giving them better commercial intelligence.
Okay. If you had to make one big prediction about the board of 10 years out in UK PLC, something that we can hang our hats on and say it'll be fundamentally different in 10 years from today. I take you back, the governance code and so on would have been 20 years ago. So 10 years on, what would you choose?
That will be different in 10 years.
Yes, one aspect that we can think about that would be fundamentally
I think
different, if anything.
The quality and the immediacy of information. I think that will continue to move on as the way forward.
I think a growing number of business leaders are recognising that businesses do not exist in isolation. They exist in society. And we're living through a very volatile period, not just in this country, but in Europe and around the world. So if we're going to, I think the answer is to extend citizenship so that it's not restricted to the social sphere, but it becomes part of our economic life too. So workers in the boardroom, 10 years, done.
Quality of data and et cetera, I think is very, very important. But the quality of the conversation is the key thing, really. And in my experience, some of the best conversations are the ones where the outcomes and the answers are least evident. And there can be a risk in data that you can just drown a board in data. You can give them reams and reams and reams of information. And frankly, for an executive, it can be quite a good way of getting your thing through because, of course, you've got some control over what goes there. And it's about posing the really tricky questions that are the most important ones for the future. That's the route to those better conversations.
Where the last few years since the financial crisis, we've been focused on getting the right people into the boardroom with the right diversity, skills, attitude, and so on. I think the next few years will be about the enablement of those people, equipping them with the tools, which I think very much are information, because information drives the conversation in the boardroom.
What you've heard this afternoon is an insight into what happens inside boardrooms and those that lobby the boardrooms to change, improve, you would say, their behaviour. Hopefully you've got some useful pointers from that. I would turn you to or refer you to the good governance debate pages that we have on the IoD website. And thank you all very much for listening to us this afternoon. Please show your appreciation to the panel. Thank you all very much.